Right. Okay. We are on recording mode, and we are going to do this course on Ramanujan's poetry, probably one of the most fascinating of the more modern poets writing Indian poetry in English. Ramanujan, of course, passed away in 1993, so it's almost 30 years after his passing that we are reading his poems. Now, you will, of course, understand, and I'm sure that your coordinator has talked to you about two major phases of Indian poetry in English. One would be the pre-independence, what I will call the more romantic phase. We've already looked at Derozio. You are taking...
স্যার আমি নেটওয়ার্কটা কেটে গিয়েছিল।
আচ্ছা জুলফিকার মাইক্রোফোনটা অফ করে দে। হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
ঠিক আছে স্যার।
Right. Now, this would also involve the poetry of Toru Datta, Michael Madhusudan Datta, Rishi Aurobindo, and also Rabindranath Tagore. Why do I call this the romantic period? Because they are largely more influenced by ideas that were central to Romanticism, an ideal state of existence, the impact of spirituality, the use of predominantly Western forms like the lyric and the sonnet, and also a certain amount of language that was still very influenced by the English register and idiom. Very little do we find entrances of Indian words, and largely the poetry falls back upon the stereotypes of Western poetry, even though Indian sensibilities are gradually being incorporated into the poetry. But in terms of language and idiom, it is still romantic, and it is still very heavily leaning on British traditions. Now, the 1950s, of course, in the meanwhile, as Rabindranath is writing, the modern revolution is taking place in literature. I would say approximately from 1910 onwards to the 1930s. Now, this impacts Indian writing in English in and around the 1940s, 50s, with the rise of the poetry of Nissim Ezekiel. In fact, the period which Rosinka's book looks at as the defining period of change and shift towards towards the modern mode in Indian poetry in English is the 1950s. What you have is a movement away from the ideal representation of spirituality or love or nature to a more hard projection of the image. Interestingly, a large amount of influence here is to the poetry of Ezra Pound, and the idea in Pound that the image is at the center of the poem, the object, the image that the object generates is at the center of the poem. Therefore, Ezekiel and Ramanujan will both take very hard, closed looks at the object. The second thing that you will find is the entry of what I will call a distinct ironic pattern in poetry. This is something which you have seen. Many of you have studied Ezekiel's poem, Night of the Scorpion. And you will see how, there is around the image of the mother bitten by the scorpion, the influx of a large number of visitors. And the mother finally recovers and proclaims that, thank God it bit me and not my children. What we're looking at is, a very serious ironic look at Indian society, superstition, the unflagging commitment of the mother to her children. Therefore, it is a poetry which is ironic towards conventions, towards spiritual beliefs, towards received religion, as it were. and sharply critical of contemporary society, be it urban, be it rural. It is this ironic tone that I say setting apart Indian poetry in English of the 1950s from its earlier counterparts. Of course, once again, rather than the abstract ideas, it is the hard image which becomes the focus of Indian poetry in English at this point of time. The figures here, of course, that you take a look at are Nissim Ezekiel, whose poetry I'm sure you've read already, Dom Morris, whose poetry you should be reading, and A.K. Ramanujan, and of course Kamala Das, who brings in the entire discourse of the woman within Indian poetry in English. And with this, I think very importantly, what we also encounter is the gradual transformation of the idiom of Indian poetry in English. It's still written in the English language, and Ramanujan, in one of his interviews, suggests that this is the greatest weakness of Indian writing in English, because English still remains a foreign language. It's still not spoken in our households, and therefore the ways of expression, the natural ways of expression, the language of the kitchen, for example, the language of the household, is the informality of that language never really penetrates into Indian writing in English. This Ramanujan is writing somewhere in 1980s. Therefore, well, we've had some years gone. So you can now also think as to whether that is true. But I think by and large, what Ramanujan is suggesting is that Indian poetry in English has never really got out of its formal quality. And therefore, Ramanujan specifically drew upon other traditions through which he was approaching the English language. But during this period, I'd say the second phase of Indian writing in English, Indian poetry in English, we are looking at subsequently more, incorporations of hard Indian life, real Indian life situations into poetry. The choice of subject matter in the sense that everyday life, rather than the high-flown rhetoric of the interface between man and God, or a kind of a ethereal setting, is replaced by a more practical, rural, recognizable Indian settings. The influx of language comes in much more. The registers of language change so that the grammar of the Indian language gradually sort of is infused into the grammar of the English language, for example. So gradually I take a look at the 1950s as a period when there is a major departure in Indian writing in English, and this departure is dependent upon two things. One is the image, choice of subject, and the other is the persistent mode of irony that is operated by the Indian poets writing in the English language throughout the 20th century, the end of the 20th century. And this is where I will place my poet, A.K. Ramanujan. Now, Ramanujan, of course, is born on 16th March, 1600, I'm sorry, I've still got back to my old 18th century, 1929. And I'll just try and project a few things which will be important for your discourse, as it were. I am sharing my screen. Do tell me if this is visible. Is it?
Yes, sir.
Right.
It's visible.
Right. Now, the point is that Ramanujan is born 16th March 1929 and is born to Orthodox Tamil-speaking Brahmins in the Kannada-speaking princely state of Mysore. Now, one of the things which it's very difficult for a lot of Europeans to understand is that how an Indian is always immersed into various languages. Take the case of us, for example. Many of us speak Bangla at our home. With our mother, I would never really think about speaking in English. That would be entirely alien. Even me and my brother would very hardly speak in English at all, right? So there is a language which is intrinsic to us, and then again we move. So if I go to, say, Maharashtra, where my brother is presently situated, he would probably speak Marathi as a language to his colleagues, to the work, to the maid who works in his house. Therefore, is always implicated in two languages. Then he will speak Hindi, and then, of course, English is the more formal. So Ramanujan, what I'm trying to suggest, is immersed in three languages. With his mother in the kitchen, he speaks Tamil, and a Tamil that is earthy, that is not formal, that is earthy and colloquial. With his group in education and friendships, he will speak Kannada, and he is educated in the English language. So this intermediate, status of his being part of three languages is a very important part of his growing up, and this will come in as a very big influence on the poetry that he will sort of write. But at this point of time, Ramanujan is still not initiated into classical Tamil poetry or Kannada poetry, right? So he knows the language, he knows the colloquial dialects, he knows the inflections of the language, but he's still not introduced to classical poetry in that particular language. His education is in English, and it's very interesting that his father is an astronomer and a professor of mathematics at Mysore University, and he practices astrology at home, right? So this strange blend of the rational and the irrational, right? Mathematics and astrology is something that continuously, impinges upon Ramanujan. He sees this as the paradox of the essential Hindu, which will figure in my classes later on. Ramanujan's ironic stance at the Hindu who supposedly has the glimpse into another, existence beyond the five senses, as it were. So one of the recurrent themes of Ramanujan's poetry is the apparent paradoxes of the modern Hindu way of thinking, which tries to blend in tradition and modernity, but that is held in a perpetual state of tension. So the Ramanujan household is a very interesting household, where he literally speaks two languages on two different floors. So on the ground floor, he speaks Tamil with his mother, and maybe Kannada with the working people. And on the first floor, where his father's library is, and his father's study is, he will speak English. Now, I am repeatedly trying to drive home this point, because this is going to figure in a very big and large way as a thematic element in Ramanujan's poetry. Now, Ramanujan is subsequently educated at Mysore, at the Maharaja College, Mysore. Very interestingly, he is admitted into physics. He takes up physics as a subject for study, but his father persuades him to give up physics, looking at his literary skills, and he takes up English. And Maharaja College at this point of time is part of the Mysore Renaissance, the Kannada Renaissance, as it were, and therefore a very formidable place of education, where the interface between tradition and modernity is quite an important aspect, just as the Bengal Renaissance really introduced Western modernity into India. Similarly, the Mysore Renaissance, I would say, was the South Indian center at which point, modernity and tradition came into a sort of interface, a contact zone, and Ramanujan is deeply impacted by this contact zone. Now, this is where Ramanujan's childhood deeply implicated in tradition, Ramanujan's young adulthood deeply impacted by the interface between tradition and modernity. Now, Ramanujan becomes a therefore he goes to teach now in the English language, teaches at Deccan College, Pune, from 1958 to 1959, right? And then becomes a Fulbright scholar at the Indiana University. That was traveling to America from 1959 to 1962, right? So you will see that if it's 1929 and it's 1959, so 30 years, Ramanujan is shifting to the US, and this becomes a permanent shift, right? But before that, let me just talk about these three languages: the formal, the kitchen, and the contextual. So the kitchen language, of course, for Ramanujan is Tamil. The contextual language, the way in which he interacts with his society, is Kannada. And the formal language in which he interacts with his peers, with is educated in, is English, right? So it's the Trishanku, as it were, is always suspended in between these three distinct traditions, languages, and cultures, right? Now travels to America, of course, on a Fulbright scholarship in 1959, as I have already told you. And then in 1962, he joins, there's a vacancy at the University of Chicago in the South Asian Studies Department. And he joins the University of Chicago as an assistant professor. And in this capacity, he works as shaping the South Indian studies program, and is invited to translate and teach both Tamil poetry, classical Tamil poetry, and classical Kannada poetry. Now, you will have to understand that these classical Tamil and Kannada poetry would involve the study of what would be called the Alvar poetry in Kannada and the Sangam poetry in Tamil. Now, here Ramanujan uses two words which I would like to deliberate on for a moment. But before that, let us see what happens. Now, Chicago becomes his home, and it is at Chicago that he dies, and is recognized as one of the most important scholars of Indian writing in English. He publishes his most significant work here. The Striders is his first book of poetry, 1966, from which I have chosen 2 or 3 poems. Relations, 1971. Second Sight, which is a very important collection again, from which I've taken a few poems, 1986. Now, Ramanujan is also publishing poems in Kannada, and he publishes this poem, Hokkulalli Huvilla. I'm sorry if my pronunciation is awfully awry here, but No Lotus in the Navel. And then Tamil poems, and these are his, if you can see on the screen, his Kannada poems. Now, at this point of time, he is into his mature years, and 1993 he passes away. 1995 we have the 4th and the last English collection, The Black Hen, published posthumously. Right. Now, Chicago is the place from which he works in the volumes of translation from Kannada and Tamil, and he writes several essays on Indian literature and Indian philosophy, of which the most important essay I will discuss very briefly as I go about discussing poetry is there an Indian way of thinking? Is there an Indian way of thinking? Now, Ramanujan there talks about, within classical Indian poetry, especially South Indian poetry, he says that South Indian poetry has 2 worlds. One, which he says, is the world of the interior, the self, love, friendship, family, parents. So this is the world of interiority, domesticity, interiority and selfhood. This he calls the poetry or the Akam poetry. The Akam poetry. So poetry of the interior world. Please note this because this is going to be a very important part of my discussion. Akam poetry. And you see, this is the Ramanujan who is now simultaneously translating poetry and writing his own poetry. So this, as it were, this binary between the Akam poetry and the Puram poetry, which I'm going to come to in a little later while, is something that he's deeply immersed in, both in terms of his translation as well as his own writing, of poetry. So Akam is the poetry of the interior world, and Puram is the poetry of the public world, right? So writing about kings, politics, he will write about Bosnia, he will write about Eichmann, is a poem that I've given to you. He'll write about a larger context of the Hindus and philosophy. So these are public subjects of poetry, subjects of the public world, right? And Ramanujan suggests that Indian poetry very often can bridge these two worlds in, for example, the Bhakti poems. Now look at the Bhakti poems. The Bhakti poems are always stories about the individual's relationship with God, right? If you look at Mirabai's songs, for example. But at a deeper level, they're also public utterances of philosophy in terms of the Hindu way in which, God can be looked at, how tradition can be challenged. Therefore, Ramanujan's poetry always borders on these two planes, the Akam poetry and the Puram poetry. Very often, the Akam poetry becomes metonymic in the sense that it contains within itself a larger references to a more wider world. Say you have a poem, which I will project in a moment. You have poems like, let me see if I do have it on my screen. I probably don't at this point of time, but subsequently I will. You have small scale reflections on a large house, for example. This house is in a sense part of the Akam world, the interior world. It belongs to a definite, specific world where Ramanujan is inhabiting, not Ramanujan, the Indian family, as it were, where everything comes in and nothing really goes out, right? Where everybody stays together, this large-scale Indian house. At the same time, that Akam house is also the Puram India, in the sense it becomes a metonymic representation of the Indian nation, where everything that comes in is intermixed, gains an identity, and becomes part of it, right? So that is where you see the Akam and the Puram come together, the two worlds come together in Ramanujan's poetry very often. This is point number one. Point number two is that Ramanujan is deeply impacted. If this is the Indian tradition, then Ramanujan is also deeply impacted by the Western tradition of modernism, and is deeply impacted by the poetry of Ezra Pound, and especially Ezra Pound's dictum that the image is the center of the poem. The image is the center of the poem. The image is truth. And Pound, you see, grinds out poetic image, as the father of imagism, if you remember, grinds out the poetic image with great economy. So Ramanujan's poetry has this pithy, concise feeling, where he looks at the image from all its angles, and sharp edges of the image are created. Now, of course, until and unless you read a poem by Ramanujan, you will not understand this. Look at the conciseness of his poetry, and look at the way in which the image is the center, the foreground of the text. All that meaning that we generate within Ramanujan is contained within that image. Please try and understand what I'm trying to suggest. I'm trying to suggest that Ramanujan is going to create the object, the body, with all its urgency, all its contours, and all its sharpness. So that is the point. That is the poetic point. The linkages or the various visions that we can take is through that image only. Tar baire kintu kichu nei, right? So the image is paramount within Ramanujan's poetry, and from the image you can then move inside into various inflections of meaning. So sight is a very important, eye and sight are very important images in Ramanujan. You have to look at that image in all its urgency, in all its physicality. At the same time, there is a second sight that looks into the deeper meanings that reside within that image. So when you're looking at that house, you're looking at it in all its urgencies, in all its details, it's sharply etched out. But if you're using this second sight, you are taking a look at the deeper nuances and larger meanings of that house. And very often, Ramanujan is going to tease you. For example, when he's talking about the Hindu way of life, he will perpetually talk about, ironically, how deeper insights are often false. You will have to read with me a poem called The River, where you find that the river in spate, the river in flood becomes a great poetic image. But the river is in reality a very dry bed. And that when poets look at the river in spate and sing songs about it, they're actually, ironically, Ramanujan points out, they're not thinking about the cow and the woman who are washed away. They're only looking at the river and its gorgeousness, right? So I would say there's a third sight within Ramanujan. The first is the image, the urgent, important, sharp image. The second sight is where you take a look at the various implications of that image, the way in which that very often interior image is linked with the exterior image or the exterior meanings. And very importantly, a third sight, which is ironic, which very often questions what these meanings can really add up to. So Ramanujan is perpetually stitching and unstitching. That's an image that Vinay Dharwarkar, for example, uses for his poetry. Stitching and unstitching meaning. And he's always looking at the interface between the body and the natural world, right? So the body, with all its warts, with all its physicality, is a very important aspect of Ramanujan. Now, herein lies a problem with Ramanujan also. Where do we really place Ramanujan? If you think of the Alvar poetry and the Sangam poetry and his use of Akam and Puram, then Ramanujan is writing within the tradition of a classical Indian poetics. At the same time, if you'll remember, Ramanujan is one of these writers who is not only translating poetry, but is also collecting folk literatures and counter systems. What do I mean here? You will, of course, have remembered that Ramanujan was at the center of a huge controversy in the sense that he suggested that there were more than 300 Ramayanas within India. And he suggested that in some Ramayanas, Ram and Sita were seen as siblings. And his essay on the Ramayana was included in the Delhi University syllabus, and it generated a lot of debate from the Hindu right, which suggested that it hurt Hindu sentiments. The three-member committee was formed up, which suggested that this piece be retained in the syllabus, but the decision was overturned in the university body. Now, therefore, you also have a Ramanujan who is a folklorist, who's deeply embroiled in the act of collecting folklore, collecting literatures from alternative traditions, the lower classes, the rural and backward communities, and therefore a Ramanujan who is deeply shaped by two Indias, one which is classical and the other which is folk. So which tradition do we place him in? There's a third Ramanujan who is the modernist Ramanujan, who is not Indian at all in that sense of the term. He is impacted by the Western traditions of modernity and is creating imagist poems in a certain way. So this is the modern Ramanujan. And then there is this Ramanujan who has moved to America. So he's a diasporic Ramanujan in the sense, when he'll be writing about Europe, for example, he writes about Chicago Zen, for example. That's a poem which I'm not going to teach you, but you can take a look at it. It's titled Chicago Zen. And he talks about how people, when they die, in the Hindu way, they will be sort of put as ash. They'll be rendered into ash. In Christianity, they will be buried. Right? He dies in a surgical procedure in Chicago. Right? So there's always this sense of alienation and belonging that is a major theme in most of Ramanujan's poetry. His identity becomes a point of debate, as one of his poems will show right now. And therefore, this is the diasporic Ramanujan. So which is the Ramanujan? Ramanujan is, of course, talk about this metaphor of stitching and unstitching identities. This continuous movement, this continuous coexistence within languages, traditions, and modernities. See, that's not just Ramanujan, but that is all of us. All of us steeped within various languages, within traditions, within modernities, within disparities, as it were. And it is these disparities, it is this multifaceted aspects of selfhood that go into the making of Ramanujan's poetry. So in that sense, Ramanujan's poetry becomes deeply complex, one which goes back to the initial debate about his father's position, the paradox that how can a man of mathematics and astronomy be so deeply impacted by astrology, right? So can a man escape his roots? Which poetry does he go back to? How does he weld the modernist imagist poetry of Pound with the Sangam and Alwar poetry of the Akam and the Puram of classical Tamil literature? And how does he bring that into a discussion on a more modern Indian sensibility, especially if it is a diasporic one? These are some of the debates that we will look at. We will look at, in our next class, aspects of how Ramanujan deals with the problem of nature and the world, of the Akam and the Puram, of the body and the natural world, of landscapes and ideas, interiorities, exteriorities. We'll talk about how deeply ironic Ramanujan's perception is. We'll talk about his poetics, and we will also talk about his larger diasporic identities. Now, as part of the course, I am planning, and I'm in conversation with the director of Casa del India, Guillermo Rodriguez, who has worked on a book on Ramanujan. He's agreed prima facie to take a class with you in the end of January, the last week of January. So I'm working on that lecture as well. But I will be devoting with this lecture 4 lectures primarily. I've circulated 10 poems, so we'll take up 3 poems on a single day almost, so that I can take a look at a corpus of Ramanujan's poetry. Now, the poem that I wanted to sort of talk about right now is a poem titled, just give me a moment to talk about, just give me a moment. I wanted to talk about is Self-Portrait. Since I've talked about Ramanujan's fundamental identities, I would have ideally liked to talk about the self-portrait of Ramanujan. Here goes the poem. Can you see this poem, Self-Portrait?
Yes, sir.
Right. So Ramanujan in this poem talks about these different shades of identity that goes into the making of his poetic selfhood. And he says, I resemble, and notice once again how short this poem is. That does not mean that every poem by Ramanujan is short. In fact, most of his poems could be also pretty large, right? So, but notice how the image of the man becomes very critical as the focal point of the poem. So I resemble everyone but myself. What is this figure of speech, by the way, if anybody can understand? Can enlighten me? If you were given this as a figure of speech, I resemble everyone but myself, what would that be? Bolo kyo bolte chao? What, as a figure of speech, what would that be? Gonna try? Take a crack. Well, just respond. Just একবার চেষ্টা করে দেখো না।
Amrita, metonymy?
No, that would not be metonymy. That would be a paradox, right? Na? It would be a paradox. I resemble everyone but myself. So it's suggesting that selfhood is not really constituted or definable, but it is somewhere impacted to a large extent by the factors that go into it. And that is where I would invite you, and this is not a text that I'm going to teach, but I'm going to ask you to take a look at it once this class is over. This is Ramanujan's essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? And Ramanujan says the Indian way of thinking has evolved, has changed with modernity, with Western modernity. He says that the earlier Indian way of thinking was context specific, right? So place, for example, caste, for example, gender, for example, were very important factors in the way people thought or people expressed themselves. With the arrival of Western modernity, this context specificity has moved towards freedom of context or freedom from context, right? So when you talk about education, for example, you no longer talk about, you have a syllabus which is uniform for everybody, right? When you talk about freedom, for example, it's a freedom that is context negative in that sense of the term. Now, of course, many of you will immediately understand how we are always placed in this debate as to whether we are free from the context or we are deeply impacted by the context. You have provincialisms, you have caste identity still impacting us. But please remember something, that modernity as such and modern discourse tries to create these categories independent of identities as such, contexts as such, whereas the Indian complexity deeply pushes the context into these debates. If you have understood what I meant, you will see that this is the great challenge to our sense of nationhood also. Now, Ramanujan says that this is context specific. So, you see, the three contexts of Ramanujan, right? Tamil, Kannada, English. So who am I is this great question that he's asking. That, you can see an image on the glass, but is that you? And who are the people, or who are the shades who are located within that you, that within that yourself? You can ask yourself that question actually. And sometimes see in shop windows. So once again, you see, this is the image, this is the reflection of a person. That image, however, is the fundamental aspect, point of the poem. That sharp image of this short, diminutive, thin, middle-aged man called Ramanujan, who looks at himself. This is a poem of the Striders, by the way, who looks at himself and asks, who am I? I resemble everyone but myself. I am there. But you see, that is the Akam, I. But there is always the Puram. Who am I? Who are the people that have gone into making me? Despite well-known laws of optics, right? So there's a physical law, the well-known laws of optics, which creates a perfect replica of you, right? So when you stand before a mirror and see your image, it follows the law of optics. But is that you? That is what Ramanujan is asking. Is that the simple me, or is it a more complex image which has the father inscribed within it, which has tradition, which has the mother, which has Chicago, which has diaspora? All of it is impacted within the portrait of a stranger. So this very important question is the question of Ramanujan's selfhood, where he himself is unknown and a stranger to himself, because he is not one person, but a person who is made of so many complexities. And you can see the mocking and the ironic vision of himself. There's a very subtle, if you really have understood this poem, there's a subtle black humor here. That look, that is my image on the shop window, but that is a stranger. That is not who I am. That is an alien. The portrait of a stranger, and very importantly, date unknown. So Ramanujan is not only looking at a physical image here, he's also looking at a physical time, right? So when I look at the mirror, this is Mr. X on the 7th of January 2020. So if I say, take a look at myself 10 years hence, if I'm alive, that is, that image will of course be Mr. X, dated 7/1 whatever, 2031 or whatever, right? So But he says that when I look at my image, it's a date unknown. So as I exist here today, am I also the impact of my father in my childhood, the impact of, say, my girlfriend in my young age? So you see, this notion of selfhood is something that Ramanujan ironically problematizes. And the point of a particular context is suddenly thrown into a lot of difficulty, as it were. So date unknown, often signed in a corner. So very often self-portraits are signed. So signed in a corner by my father. So once again, my father is a figure, right? My father is a figure. So we all resemble our fathers in certain ways. And it is our childhood sensibilities, and his father being this very ambiguous gentleman who could exist in this paradox between, and you see, the father's paradox is the paradox of the self-portrait, is the paradox of the person who was deeply involved in tradition as well as in modern education, a scientist as well as an astrologer, right? So Ramanujan is somewhere talking about his father's paradox is shaping his own paradox as a poet who is both following Pound as well as Alwar and Sangam poetry. There's also this question of the larger father. And somebody just mentioned metonymy, in the sense that father is also the entire tradition of India, right, from which he has come. And where he's standing is in Chicago, right, where the diasporic individual can never shake off his own rootedness. So when Ramanujan is writing this poem, is also talking about this hyphenated image, or this hyphenated identity of the diaspora. The diaspora is always Indian/American, right? So that dash, Indian-American, that is the hyphen. So diasporic identity is always hyphenated, that he can, much as he will try to attain Chicago Zen, he will always get back to the Indian tradition. What better than Ramanujan, who, writing in Chicago, is translating Indian poetry written centuries ago. So three things come into it. One is identity. Can he really escape his Indian identity? Can the diasporic hyphenated identity ever be lost? The concept of time, in the sense that he is here in the now, but he's always immersed in the past. So our selfhoods are always impacted by our traditions, our past, our myths that we share. And of course, also this personal history of Ramanujan, where he's immersed in writing an imagist English poem written from Chicago, but he can never escape the impact of the West, of the classical Tamil situations, where the Akam and the Puram forever interact. So it is this immersity within multiple situations, multiple selfhoods. It is this, as it were, stitching and unstitching of identities. It is this perpetual suspension within multiple identities in ironic modes that Ramanujan always talks about. And this poem, I think, serves as a very good introduction to the corpus of his poetry. So I'll let you sort of take a little more look at the poems that I have circulated. You will, of course, find in Rosinka Chaudhury's book, which I had already circulated for Derozio, a very fine essay on Ramanujan. You can take a look at it. I will expect you to today research on Ramanujan's poetry, and I will expect that you will try and take a look at Ramanujan's essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? Now, Ramanujan in that essay says that that question, is there an Indian way of thinking, can be asked in 4 ways. He says it can be asked like this: is there an Indian way of thinking? He says it can be asked in this way: is there an Indian way of thinking? Is there an Indian way of thinking? Or is there an Indian way of thinking? Right. So 4 different questions can be asked. In Ramanujan's poem, very often there is an image, there's an object, which is described in its minutiae, which is described in its fine, sharp edges. And using that image, Ramanujan often probes into the deeper significances that the image unleashes, the paradoxes of our identities, and very ironically, using a very subtle kind of a humor, explores these multiple ramifications of Indian modernities, which is essentially complex. I would say that it is in this that I've seen this linkage between Derosio and Ramanujan. You might just ask, why did this man who never really taught Indian poetry in English to his students suddenly link up or think of Derosio and Ramanujan? I thought of them as, historical continuities. Derosio at the early period of Indian modernity, trying to think as to whether there is an Indian modernity. And Ramanujan then asking a question, is there an Indian modernity? So what is this modernity going to be like? How complex and paradoxical is this Indian modernity? Is a question that I'm seeking in this course. But that is not enough, because I am not a thesis writer on modernities. What I am trying to also explore is if there is an Indian modernity, and that Indian modernity is complex and evolutionary, then how does one express that Indian modernity? What are the poetic traditions on which one falls back? And how does that poetics of Indian modernity evolve? That is the question that is essentially something that I am going to ask in the discussion on the next 9 poems that I'm going to teach. I will, with that, bring today's lecture, today's discussion to a more or less close right now. Please remember that I will not be able to take questions today. And I don't want to take questions because I want you to ask yourselves these questions. Take a look at the Self-Portrait. Take a look at, is there an Indian way of thinking? Take a look at the other poems. Do a little bit of research on Ramanujan. And tomorrow, maybe we will have a more intense round of discussion of 3 poems, followed by your questions. Right. It is with that I will bring today's recording to a close, and I will here